And it is an honor to have our dear friend Christine Bader with us today, and all of you as well. I'm going to turn the podium over for a moment to my friend and former student and MSFS alum, Michael Samway. Michael, as I think many of you know, was Vice President and Deputy General Counsel at Yahoo, and has recently joined us here at MSFS to head up our initiative in business and human rights. He will introduce our distinguished speaker and maybe talk a little bit about that initiative. So, ladies and gentlemen, Michael Samway.
The Business and Human Rights Initiative, which has been supported by Tony Aaron, by Ambassador Mark Lagon, by Professor John Klein, by a number of others in the School of Foreign Service, is a new initiative at Georgetown built around teaching, scholarship, and impact, and with a focus for the first year or so on technology. We're honored to have Christine Bader's new book be a part of the first event that we're hosting publicly in the Business and Human Rights Initiative. I've agreed not to introduce Christine with too elaborate an introduction because most of you know her. This feels a little bit like a family reunion.
My weddings was great.
I've known Christine for about 10 years. As a personal friend and professional colleague, she's written an extremely thoughtful, provocative in some ways, book that will make you think differently, I think, about business and about other stakeholders in the business and human rights community. And we're honored to have her here. And I'd also like to thank Mark Gunther for graciously agreeing to moderate. Mark is a veteran journalist, writer, speaker on business and sustainability. So with that, Christine and Mark, thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for inviting me, Christine. I don't think anyone mentioned the name of the book. So it is called When Girl Meets Oil, The Evolution of a Corporate Idealist. If there was more room on the cover, they might have called it When Girl Meets Oil, When Girl Dates Oil, Girl Falls in Love with Oil, Girl Breaks Up with Oil, Girl Decides Oil might just be kind of a cad after all of that. So
That's pretty much it. You've summed it up.
There it is. So let's start with When Girl Meets Oil. It's 2000. Christine is dispatched to Indonesia. She's a newly minted MBA from Yale, very idealistic. And hoping to display her business skills, work with spreadsheets, she all of a sudden finds herself in a village where BP, her new employer, is building a gigantic natural gas project. And the challenge is they are moving 127 villagers out of a place they've lived for a long time, and what are you going to do with those folks? So pick up the story. What did you do with those folks? Why was this new and different? And what did you learn from that first experience, first project that you worked on in corporate America?
Right.
I shouldn't say corporate America, I should say global business.
Say the world of corporations. Right. Well, I guess I can start with what it was like to first see it, because as you say, I went to Indonesia and I was supposed to be using my brand new MBA skills, crunching data and doing spreadsheets. But I was interested in the role of business in society and told everybody who would listen that that's what I was interested in. But as you say, this was in 2000 and CSR was sort of around, but wasn't really a big thing. And I went out there thinking, okay, this is what business people do, so I'm going to do my spreadsheets. And BP had just taken over ARCO, the American Oil Company, and so I was there to help with the commercial analysis of the assets that BP had acquired. So analyzing, okay, which of these projects should BP keep and sell and spin off, and what should we do with all this stuff? So I was crunching data. But as I was doing that, there was one project in particular that was proving really interesting. And it was not interesting from a technical or economic standpoint. It was pretty straightforward. I mean, it was a big, fat, juicy gas field, really close to the surface, really easy to develop, and BP was going to build an LNG, a liquefied natural gas processing plant. And BP's done that all over the world, but never in a place like West Papua. So I kept, I was doing my spreadsheets, but then I kept getting distracted. There were all these memos flying by about the social and environmental and human rights sensitivities around this project, and I kept thinking, okay, that's a lot more interesting. So that's what I started working on full time. And the rest is history, but...
So what happened? I mean, first of all, was it new, the idea that BP was responsible for the livelihoods of the folks who were displaced from the project? Was that a given from day one, or was that a conversation that had to be had?
Well, it's interesting the way that you put it. Was BP responsible for the livelihoods? I wouldn't say that it was framed like that from the start. I'd say that the conversation going in was, oh my goodness, we're in this incredibly sensitive situation. And there were lots of terrible examples in that province alone, never mind in the rest of Indonesia, where things had gone horribly wrong when the company hadn't gotten these issues right from the start. So the Freeport-McMoRan, the Grasberg copper and gold mine, with one of the largest mines in the world, had seen decades of social strife. And on the other end of the country, in Aceh, ExxonMobil had a similar, an LNG facility that had to shut down for 4 months because of basically the civil war going on around it that a lot of people accused the company of exacerbating. And this had some pretty big dollar figures on it. So I think at first it was a conversation about how do we mitigate some of these risks. But I do think that there was an interest in seeing, okay, can we actually refute the resource curse? Why is it a given that when a company goes into a remote place to extract natural resources that it has to be a terrible thing? Is that really true? And we have an opportunity here to find out.
And how did that work out both for BP and for you?
Yeah, how'd that go, right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think part of the challenge of this work, which is what I talk about in the book, is that it's too early to tell, right? What about the French Revolution, right? It's too early to tell. And because it's going to be decades. I mean, BP is going to be there for, 40, 60 or more years, depending on how the reserves come out. And it could all go horribly wrong in a heartbeat if some, soldier who's hyped up on crystal meth, which is not uncommon there, comes in and shoots up the village one day. All of the company's best efforts won't mean anything. So A, it's going to take a long time. It's going to take generations to see if the education and the training and the investment in creating a sustainable economy will actually pay off. But it's also not in the company's control. So for the project, I think signs are good right now, but it's too early to tell. But you asked about it for me as well, and I think it was an incredibly formative experience.
Because?
Just to get to see, I mean, this was my first job out of business school. Right? And so I went out there, and this was a flagship project. This was a big reason why BP took over ARCO. And so to be out there and to have all the backing of senior management, have all the resources, say, we'd really like to try to do this human rights impact assessment. Okay. We'd like to hire a team of community liaison officers. Okay, sure. Whatever you think you need. And so imagine me, this is my first job, right? I thought, yeah. I love big oil. Right? I love big business.
And
this is how it works.
This is, of course, the John Brown era at BP after the famous speech about climate change at Stanford, et cetera, which was one reason, I guess I should have said, you went to work for the company.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But people talk about this idea of a social license to operate. Mm-hmm. I'm not quite sure I understand what it means, but did BP in effect get a social license? In other words, there were not the problems that either Freeport had or Exxon had at the other end of the country.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
So that then led you to China.
Yep.
Different situation, joint venture with Sinopec.
Yeah.
Why don't you explain what a couple of the issues were there and how you dealt with them?
Sure. So this was a 50-50 joint venture between BP and Sinopec, one of China's state energy companies. And it was to build a petrochemicals plant that would bring in a migrant construction workforce of about 20,000 people into a town of about 30,000 people. So could be some impacts there. And so
just a little.
A little bit, right? And so so I was brought in by the BP half of the joint venture, of course, to see, okay, can you just have a look around and see if we should be doing anything differently? And so it turned out, yeah, there were a couple things we should be doing differently. So the first week that I got there, I was in a meeting and it was the BP guys on one side of the room and the Sinopec guys on the other side of the room. And I sat in on this meeting, and we were going through the spreadsheet with the latest projections for the cost and the timeline. And there was one label on the spreadsheet that hadn't yet been translated into English, and the number was 8. So one of the BP guys said, what's the label? What's the 8? And he said, that's the projected number of fatalities. I'm sorry, what? And he said, well, yeah, with this many man hours and a project this big, we'd expect 8 fatalities. And and the BP guy said, well, the target is not 8. The target is 0. And he sort of said, that's not realistic. He said, well, if you've set a target of 8 fatalities, you're probably going to kill at least 8 people. Right. He said, well, that's not realistic. So you can start to see what my job became. It was just these conversations about what are we responsible for, what is realistic.
And there were real debates about how much to invest in safety and how much to invest in sort of the living conditions in the dormitories that were going to get built and all that. And
Yeah.
you describe essentially BP trying to sort of pull Sinopec along.
Yeah.
How did it go, and what was the argument that finally at least moved them somewhat along?
Yeah, well, I guess I came in there thinking, okay, well, this is about, we're going to protect the human rights of the workers. And that didn't go so well. I mean, it did, I didn't get thrown out, but I just got these sort of blank stares of what are you talking about? And then I tried, well, these are the standards that BP projects use around the world, and so that's what we should use here. And that didn't land so well either. They were like, thanks, we've got our own standards. So what finally worked there, in my case, was that I had to shut up for a couple of weeks and just listen to what resonated with people, what motivated people. And so finally I came back with, okay, I understand that you want this to be a world-class model project, and if that is the case, then we have to use these international standards. These are the standards that world-class model projects use. And they were like, oh, okay, why didn't you say so?
I thought there was also an argument about sort of reputation and saving face in China.
Exactly.
No one wanted to be embarrassed, essentially.
Exactly. And so that would be the downside. And then the upside is we want this to be a model project. One of the Sinopec guys, it turned out there were rumors that he wanted to be the mayor of Shanghai. So again, you have to listen to what motivates people.
And you lay out in some conversations that you had with other folks who you put under this label of corporate idealists, the question of sort of how to take your case to senior executives when you're pushing for a change. And I like the way you describe a corporate idealist. I may not get this quite right. It was an insider. To the people outside, you're an insider, and to the people inside the company, you're an outsider. So you're kind of an advocate for issues that are arising elsewhere in the company, but when you're dealing with NGOs and other critics, they see you essentially just as another corporate executive insider.
Exactly.
So my question is, and you wrestle with this, what tends to work better, the do the right thing argument or the business case argument? I know when I ask a CEO, why did you do X and Y, they say, because doing the right thing is in the DNA of our company. What's the real story inside?
It's fun to play bingo, isn't it, when you're doing those interviews? You say, it's in our DNA, we're on a journey, we can't do this alone, right? Yeah, exactly. Now, it's a good question, Mark, because it totally depends who you're talking to. I mean, for some CEOs, it really is about doing the right thing, and when you're the CEO and you want to do the right thing, you can channel resources to get that thing done. But as I found in China, it really is about what motivates the person sitting right in front of you. And I have a quote in the book from Dave Stangus, who was at Campbell Soup and was at Intel for a long time, and he's been in this space for a long time. And he said, those of us who've been working in this field, we used to think we had to evangelize, right? If only we could get everybody to think like this. If only everybody would, embrace sustainability like we do. So it was about evangelizing. And he said, I realized that doesn't work. And so he told me about when he first joined Campbell's, his CEO wanted to announce these big, bold targets. And he's like, let's do it on the back of a napkin right now, and then I can announce it, and then you can go out and tell everybody. And he was like, Doug, they're going to hate me if I do that, and it's not going to work. You need to give me some time to go meet with people and hear what resonates, hear what they're paid to do, hear what motivates them and what drives them. So I think for some people, the business case is important and you got to go in there with your spreadsheets. But I'm actually not a big fan of totally relying on the business case, because I think that for some of the issues that we're talking about, when you're talking about human rights, at some point you need to realize that the business case argument is kind of ridiculous. And Ford saw this with the Pinto, right? And I think that, you don't really want to get into this conversation of saying, okay, well, we need to spend $11 million this year on community investment, on our security arrangements, making sure that they conform with human rights practices so that we can avoid being complicit in genocide. I don't want the response to be, well, I don't know if I have 11 million. If I spend 5 million, is there like a 50% chance that we're going to be complicit in genocide? And it's like, come on, seriously? And I know that, come on, seriously, is not how you walk into a budget meeting. But I think at some point it actually is.
Have you ever stood up in a meeting and said, we really have to do this? There may not be a business argument, but it's the right thing to do? Or is that not effective generally?
Well, that's part of the reflection in the book, because I never had to do it. And thinking back on my time with BP and trying to think about, well, why? Because at the time, again, I was like, oh my God, business is great. They really want to just, everywhere I'm going, right, in Indonesia and then in China, I'm getting all these resources and all this support. And I'm realizing that is not often the case. But I think that for the projects that I worked on, now again, looking back and realizing that they were the anomalies, they are the exceptions, not the rule, they were so lucrative and important and strategic and complicated for the company that I did get all the backing that I wanted to. So I was never in a position of having to say, come on, like we really have to do this. And of the people that I interview in the book, the companies that had gone through crises, those people really didn't have to do a lot of arguing because everybody got it. But then the sad irony is that if people are really good at doing these jobs and nothing goes wrong, nobody gets rewarded for something that doesn't happen, right? So after a few years, I start to say, well, what are you doing here? Like, you're mitigating these risks that clearly, haven't come to fruition. But they say, well,
there's that joke about it keeps the elephants away, right?
Right. Right, exactly.
There's an argument that the whole effort to sort of bring corporate responsibility standards from the Western world to the developing world is both arrogant and disempowering. And let me just give you an anecdote and get your reaction to it. One of the board members at Hasbro told me he once went to he had a board meeting actually at one of their factories in China. He's talking to the local migrant workers who are essentially living there, and they're going to go back to their village, and the worker says to him, you have this 50-hour maximum week, 50-hour maximum work week, and yet I'm here, my family's in the village, I want to send all the money I can back, I want to be here for a couple of years and go back. Why are you setting standards, I'm sure it wasn't said quite this way, but why are you exporting your Western standards to China? Similarly, to the degree that, Western companies set safety, health, wage, other standards in Bangladesh's garment industry, they're kind of letting the government and letting the workers off the hook. So, do you worry that there's there's something amiss here?
Amiss in trying to impose these?
Amiss in the sense that we are bringing, U.S. 21st century values to countries that are doing what the U.S. did in the 19th century, which was go through industrialization, have child labor, and figure it all out.
Yeah. No, I hate this argument. I really do, Mark. I mean, what I say to that worker of, well, I want to work, I want to work 120 hours a week. Why are you stopping me? Because I want to, bring money home to my family. And I say, well, I want you to go home to your family and not in a box. I mean, these standards exist for a reason. These standards exist to protect lives. And so, it drives me actually a little bit, you hit one of my buttons here. I mean, it drives me a little bit crazy, the whole 3 cheers for sweatshops thing. I mean, it drives me crazy actually, because there is a big difference that I think we've lost in this debate between a factory that pays the national legal minimum wage. And yeah, you and I wouldn't want to work there, but it is legal and it is safe. And a sweatshop where the building's going to fall down and kill people, and people are beaten, and people are not allowed to stand up from their seats for 12 hours. So no, I don't apologize for upholding international standards on working conditions and human rights. If you want to argue about, well, they came from over there and they don't apply here, sorry, they're there for a reason.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, all right.
Just ask the question.
Sorry,
No.
I'm going to attack you.
So I want to move on to the next phase, and maybe one way to do this with talking about your next boss was John Ruggie. It might get us back to this question of how to talk to business people. You described him, I think it was on a visit to a Coca-Cola plant, taking a detailed interest in the plumbing and the formulas and how it all worked, and you were wondering what was going on, and there was an interesting lesson there.
Oh, yeah. So, that was, my first trip with him, and we went to a Coca-Cola supplier, to a bottling plant, and to a sugar plantation in Colombia. And, those of you who haven't met John Ruggie, he's an esteemed, tenured faculty at Harvard, and we spent all this time. John, he was best friends with the plant manager, and they're walking around, and John's John doesn't speak Spanish, and the plant manager doesn't speak it, but they're sort of gesticulating wildly, and we'd been walking around for hours, and the rest of us, his team, is exhausted, and they're pointing to all the chutes and the pipes, and where do they go, and he was loving this, and we were just John, we're supposed to be coming up with international principles and standards here, why does it matter which, but he was loving it. But I realized later that was his great strength, was really connecting with everybody who he came into contact with, and really just wanting to listen to what, it was like what I learned in China, right? You really have to listen very hard to what drives people and what motivates people and what are they concerned about. And and it's well, if this shoot doesn't connect, who do you call? How do you escalate a concern?
Yeah, and that's the Dave Stangis lesson as well, which is essentially listening is a very underrated skill in the corporate world, also not practiced very well sometimes.
Yes, very true.
So about to open this up, you write about the UN. There's a section where you describe the Human Rights Council deciding whether to, quote, welcome or, quote, endorse the principles on human rights, which to me just sums up the UN in a sentence or two. And my question to you, I'm quoting from the book here, do these pieces of paper, policies, codes, principles, declarations, make any difference? I'm thinking now about the UN human rights principles.
Yeah.
And I'm definitely not an expert on this, but my very much outsider's perspective is to be skeptical. So persuade me that they do make a difference.
Okay, I'll try. Right. So I, like you, came into this, the whole arc of that experience was that I joined, working for John Ruggie, and working for him was amazing to see him in action, and being at the epicenter of international policy making was really cool. But then, after a couple of years of sort of another conversation of, well, welcome or endorse or whatever, I just started to think, really? But I got it. I got that these standards matter. And here's why I think they matter. So the welcome and endorse thing matters in UN land, and that's sort of a separate conversation. But the land that you and I, why do they matter in the other in the other land that we inhabit? What's been really interesting to see about the guiding principles is how they have been taken up by lots of other entities, right? So ISO 26000, right, the new social responsibility guidance from ISO, incorporates, is very consistent with the guiding principles. It's got a whole new human rights chapter, and you know how much companies love ISO, right? There's a whole industry built around making sure that companies are compliant with ISO. So that's having an effect there, right? So now the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, they now in their sustainability policies have a section that references the guiding principles. And so it not only has an effect then on IFC funded projects, but then the Equator Principles, which is a standard for private banks, which is very much based on the IFC standards. Now there's human rights then incorporated in those. And now what we're seeing is, so there are a bunch of international standards that include the guiding principles, but then you see individual companies who are actually using these standards because there's some practical guidance, and they see, oh, okay, there's international consensus around this, including from the business community, because they're helpful. And you see NGOs and investors using it in their advocacy of going to companies and saying, hey, this is a new international standard. Can you tell us how you're in compliance or how you're implementing these, or whatever the terminology that they use is. And you're seeing some governments take bits and pieces of it and incorporate it into their new policies, their new listing requirements. So I think that the kind of normative or viral uptake, that's where it's making a difference in our world.
Okay, good. I've got one or two more questions, but let me take it out to the floor. There's one already right there.
Yeah.
And Michael, we're going to just ask people to stand
Yeah,
and
if you could
briefly
stand.
identify themselves too.
Okay. Hi, I'm Tara Holmes. Staying on this topic, international financial institutions, putting on your strategy hat, what's next? I do feel the IFC and Equator Principles uptake is very slow.
Yeah.
A lot of institutions are saying, well, we can leverage on the private side of the equation, but not always public authorities. And I feel like it's so slow. Why isn't the financial world moving faster? And I'm wondering if you see, what can we do, in the next generation of getting other banks involved?
Yeah, it's a good question, Tara. I mean, I think it is moving really slowly, and I think that financial institutions are surprisingly slow to change. I mean, they're very risk averse, right? And as you remember, the whole conversation around the Equator Principles, around getting that going, was a few banks, starting saying this was important, but then a bunch of other banks saying, we can't do this. If we impose these requirements on our clients, they're going to walk down the street and get their financing elsewhere. So it took a long time for other banks to sign up, and now I think there's critical mass, I think. But it's slow to change. So I guess that's the question about financial institutions, but you did ask this other question, which is what can all of the rest of us do? And did you mean us as private citizens or people who work in this space?
Or professionals in the space, perhaps,
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess there are a number of things, and what I talk about in the book is, what do they need from other people to be more effective in what they do, right? And I mentioned somebody who said that he would often, place a well-timed call to one of his NGO or investor friends that said, this would be a good time for you to write a letter to my CEO about this issue. So I think leveraging external pressure, because that's really important. I mean, now I don't think you really need to do that. You can tweet, right, or you can write a post on Facebook. But I do think that we all need to be asking the question. I mean, I think there are enough banks that it's not like you would sort of ask your bank, well, why aren't you a signatory to the Equator Principles? But maybe you could. I mean, I don't know if that's the best example because it is a bit obscure and not so consumer facing. But I think in general we could be a lot more demanding.
Yeah, Kai.
Kai Robertson, and interestingly enough, I was similarly intrigued by BP back in 2004. So when I was working at Conservation International, and they had the Beyond Petroleum campaign, and I thought, what a cool idea! Use BP, play on words, Beyond Petroleum. It's not just about petroleum. And so I kind of drank the Kool-Aid, you did, right? And I thought, this is great. And I'm likewise from business background, and think that companies can do good as well. And John Brown was on the board of CI, so I met him and was equally thinking, great leader, great company, to partner with. So then the things happen, right? And I also believe that companies are are about the people, right? So at the end of the day, it is a decision by an individual, and not everybody who works for, all the millions of employees are not necessarily they don't make the smartest choices.
Yeah.
So my question is actually about like the reputational impact. I don't know if you had a sense on this, but they do say companies that have built their reputation up by doing the right thing, in quotes, along the way, and being transparent and communicating with stakeholders, when there is an incident, when there is a crisis, that the loss in reputational value, whether it's financial or otherwise, that loss in equity isn't as bad,
Yeah.
right? As if they had not similarly been had a strong
Right.
reputation going into the crisis. So
Right.
I don't know if you were able to give a
Yeah.
view on that.
I mean, I've seen and could observe both ways, frankly, right? So, I mean, a lot of the analysis of BP after the Deepwater Horizon disaster, I think it was much worse because the company had put such a stake in the ground of being a leader in responsibility. But I think that on the flip side, you're right that there are companies who have gone through disasters, but because they established strong relationships, it went away. Like John Ruggie would often cite the case of the Gap when child labor was found in a subcontractor in India. And actually the story kind of went away because there were a bunch of NGOs that stood up and said, look, the Gap has been looking at this issue harder and longer than any other brands. And frankly, if any brand stands up and says that we don't have child labor in our subcontracted supply chain, they're probably lying. So I think that there are probably a couple of different dimensions of it. There's the sort of public, let's tear down the company that claimed to be doing so great. But then there's also the private, if there's a bank of goodwill to draw on.
And this was the third or fourth serious setback for BP.
Yeah.
So it
the
was
bank
not
was
an
overdrawn
anomaly.
already.
Yeah.
The bank was overdrawn.
Yeah.
Bennett, please.
Yeah.
And if you do a Twitter question, I'll be stunned, Bennett.
I was going to wait, but I wanted to pick up on Kyle's good question and this theme that it's really about the people. And I really believe that. It was about Christine and others at BP, who commissioned Garen and me to do the Human Rights Impact Assessment. It was really much about you guys, and that was a remarkably inventive act at the time. And this is a question really that I raised with Christine a couple weeks ago that I thought people would find interesting. I just got a couple months ago a mailing from BP, an update on their human rights approach, and there was no mention of human rights impact assessments, even though they'd done the first one ever. There was no mention of voluntary principles on security and human rights, even though they were the lead company that made it possible. And it just made me wonder and worry about how to institutionalize, these kinds of commitments and performance over time. And what do you do when the whole team that you were part of moves on? What does Coca-Cola do to name a name when our friend Ed Potter retires in another year or two, given the enormous turnaround that's depended a lot on him and on others the last half dozen years? What do we have to do culturally to really institutionalize this kind of commitment?
It's a great question, Bennett.
Yeah.
And I think that part of it is that if those practices are so well embedded in what the company sees as just really basic risk management, stakeholder engagement, then that's what needs to happen, right? Leadership transition should be irrelevant, and institutional memory shouldn't be dependent on a couple of people. So yeah, as you say, it is sort of disappointing to see, we don't really know. We can guess from what they're saying, but we don't really know what's going on in different assets within the company. They could well be doing human rights impact assessments, but we don't know about it. And I guess what I found when I was working in headquarters and started convening people from around the world is that people had no idea what each other was doing, which is not that surprising in a company in 100 countries and 100,000 people, which is what it was at the time. So I think it's a great question, Ben, and I think the goal here is to make this work not dependent on a couple of people, that it's got to be so deeply ingrained in just how the company does business that of course it's not going to go away.
How important is the role of social investors like Calvert, activist NGOs that are bringing pressure on these companies? Are they influential? Are they an important part of the ecosystem?
Oh, hugely, hugely influential. I mean, I think, I talk about this in the book, and I interviewed a number of advocates, and actually I have to say that was really fun. That was one of the delights of writing it, is that I got to talk to advocates who I've known for a really long time, but I'd never actually talked to them about their tactics and how they think about their tactics. And I talked to a couple of people who I quoted in the book as saying that actually they see their role as trying to help create space in the company for the corporate idealists to do what they do. And I'd never really heard any of them say that. So I thought that was really interesting. That, yeah, it can seem really adversarial, but actually I totally agree that what they do is help create that space for people to move forward.
I think there's an interesting conversation to be had about the role of incremental improvement,
Yeah.
both in the environmental area in particular, but maybe the human rights area as well. You have a quote here from Kevin Hagan, who
Yeah.
worked at REI, and he says, incremental improvements are really important even if they're not sufficient, because they set the organization up for understanding what real breakthroughs might be. That's
Yeah.
one side of the argument. The other is that putting solar panels on the roof or writing a nice policy allows companies to say, I checked the box, I did my thing, I have something to put in my report.
Yeah.
And that, in fact, by applauding these things, we are making it harder to bring about the kind of transformational change, particularly in the environmental area, that we need. So what do you think about incrementalism?
That's really interesting, Mark. I mean, I not to give away the punchline of the book, but I do come to believe that incrementalism is what this work is all about, that we can't change these companies overnight. And so for people who criticize incrementalism, I'm not really sure what the alternative is. There are people saying, well, that's not good enough, so we shouldn't do anything. Like, I don't quite get that. I mean, it is an interesting question of, the sort of, does it allow companies to tick the box and move on? But I guess what that does is it then makes that the norm. So that if these incremental steps say, okay, we did that and now it's in our report, then actually that kind of moves the baseline a little bit. Like, yeah, of course we're going to do some of this.
I guess
And okay, what are we going to do next year? Well, we're going to do a little bit more.
it's perhaps a question more for people outside the company, particularly
Yeah.
the business-friendly NGOs that sometimes get into financial relationships with companies.
Yeah.
Are they pushing as hard as they can and should push? Do you have a point of view on that?
Oh, well, I think there's a role for a great, big, wide spectrum of NGOs to sit everywhere on the spectrum. Like, we need some that are going to do that sort of hand-holding and like, it's okay, this isn't scary, here's what we're going to do next. And you need some who are being really loud and banging on the door and screaming from the rooftops. There's a role for all of them.
Please. Oh, and right in the back.
So, I'm Gare Smith. First, Christine, thanks for writing such a wonderful and fun book. Everybody here appreciates it a lot. My question is, in many respects, credibility is the 21st century Rosetta Stone for transparency. And you've used the term public-facing a couple of times this evening, because companies that are public-facing are more susceptible to pressure. Bennett and the Calvert Group and different socially responsible investors, you could lump in as public-facing.
Yeah.
And there seems certainly over the last decade to be a trend towards influencing companies that are public-facing. But
Yeah.
how do you deal with parastatals? Whether it's in the extractive sector or in the ICT industry or other places where a government controls everything, and it's in many cases a repressive government,
Yeah.
it doesn't play by the same rules, isn't responsible to consumer-facing groups, isn't responding to letters from SRIs, because none of them are invested in it. And you don't have a level playing field.
Yeah.
Whether you're a BP or a smaller company trying to capitalize on the international stage.
Yep.
How do we deal with that?
Yeah, well, Gary, you know better than most, so I might even ask you to answer your own question. I mean, what I can speak to again is my own experience working in China, right? So it's partly about risk mitigation and then partly about, well, what's going to work for these individual people? And for them, again, it was about reputation and saving face. I do think it's really interesting what's going on with Chinese extractive companies in Africa. Like they have brought in the Swedish and British governments to do corporate social responsibility training for their managers because they've realized these tremendous risks of not getting these issues right. So for me, I think it's I see the risk mitigation argument as being the big one. But do you see something different?
Well, I guess I would argue, coming back to BP, there is an argument for co-opting them. And I think BP in Iraq is a case where a Western company has a certain wherewithal and skill set that, in this case, the Chinese, it doesn't have to be the Chinese, lack. And so they want to learn that skill set, they want to learn those things, they're willing to do a joint venture. And in southern Iraq, in Basra, BP says, we'll do that because we have things we want from you, but we're going to follow the voluntary principles.
Right.
And this is going to become part of our modus operandi.
Right.
And I've actually been there with the Chinese who think this is a pretty good idea because this is good for business and people aren't being upset. So I think to the extent there can be a co-option in the sense that there is a certain value that you're accruing from it that enhances business. I mean that's one angle. Yeah.
Well, and I hope that that's the only angle. I don't think that any of the stuff that we're talking about is extraneous. It is about creating value for everybody and just not at somebody else's expense.
In the back, and I think we'll probably wrap here.
Yeah.
Much of the story you're flipping through.
Just identify yourself, please.
I'm Mark Lagon. I'm a curricular chair in the MSFS program. So much of the rest of your book, from flipping through, not having yet read word for word, is about how you can advocate within the business context for corporate responsibility and sustainability. But I'm sort of interested in cues for how outsiders can talk to business from the experience of John Ruggies' work. There was skepticism on the part of the business community about the whole Ruggies project. I was a deputy assistant secretary at the State Department talking about the mandate. There was even skepticism on the part of sort of free market oriented governments about asking businesses to have responsibilities at the UN. So the consultations, which were numerous, some in person, some online and so on, they were listening. But are there any lessons from the process of the consultations of talking to business or the delivery of the guiding principles that give cues to people who are in government or in the NGO world about how to talk to business about human rights being in their interest, not just a values issue?
Yeah, Mark, that's great. I think your question, the way you phrased your question was actually a little bit telling of how do you talk to business. And I think part of what John Ruggie did so well was did a lot more listening than he did talking. And so, those of you who participated in his consultations remember that, he, particularly in the beginning when the consultations were very contentious. I mean, people shouting and walking out of the room. And he wouldn't say much over the course of the day. And then at the end when he would summarize, he'd just do these summaries that, first of all, were very incredibly sort of lucid, but more importantly, I think everybody heard a little bit of what they said in his summary. Like he would play back a little bit. So I think people walked out of there, including companies, feeling like, yeah, he heard me. He heard me, and I own a little bit of that. But everybody was walking out thinking that because he was so good at it. So I think, that's the theme of the chapter that I write on the UN process about creating ownership, because that's the lesson, not just for people working in that system, but people working in companies too, is that you've got to create ownership of the people that you're trying to convince so that you don't have to do any convincing. Like if you're trying to convince somebody, you're probably already losing the battle. But I think that, engaging business works well because we did so much consultation. I mean, we had an online consultation that I managed that got, thousands of visitors where we put the draft out there and said, tell us what you think. And here's how we're incorporating your feedback. So the transparency, contributed to the credibility as well. But it was all about, creating ownership. And I think that worked on an individual level for John and then also for the other people who I talk about in the book. One of them saying that one of her own personal key performance indicators for her own success was when she heard senior people like parroting her ideas back, that she knew she was actually getting somewhere. So I think for John, one of his skills was getting other people to take ownership. So it was a personal skill, but then it was also built into the process of consultation. Yeah.
Taking your point,
Uh-huh.
talk with business, not to business.
Yeah.
How about substance?
Yeah.
Of arguments that
Yeah.
got traction?
Yeah.
Because ultimately, there are other stakeholders that need to get across messages about human rights being in the interests of business. So
Yeah. Okay, got it. Yeah. So risk mitigation, again, is the big one. And one of John Ruggie's annual reports to the Human Rights Council actually, pointed out some of the dollar figures that are at stake for companies getting this wrong. And I talk about that a bit in the book, right? Like some of the dollar figures of the incidents that I talked about before when ExxonMobil had to shut their plant down for 4 months. I found a couple of different figures, but it was anywhere from $100 million to $350 million. And that's a pretty big number, even for ExxonMobil. And there are other incidents where there's the downside is pretty clear. So I think framing it as risk mitigation makes sense. And then the trick is to reframe the notion of risk so that it's not just risk to the company, it actually includes risk to stakeholders as well. So it's sort of hooking companies in with the language of due diligence, which every company does, of risk mitigation. And then I have a quote there from Aaron Kramer who said the trick is to get them to the table and then move the table. Right? So it's getting the hook of risk mitigation and but then again reframing it so that we're not just talking about risks to our bottom line, we're talking about risks to communities and the planet. And sometimes those two are the same thing, but often they're not. So that's why we need to reframe that conversation. But again, I think part of the success of that and the success of the people I talked to in the book is using the language of business.
So
Great. So
Yeah.
first
Can
of
I
all,
say a couple of thank yous too,
Of
just before?
course you
Okay,
can.
sorry. So I want
What
to
am I
thank
gonna
you.
say, no?
Okay. Yeah, no, you may not. So thank you,
Oh, my pleasure.
Mark, for doing this. But I want to thank my friends at Georgetown. So thank you, Michael. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, everybody. I also want to thank a couple people here who are in the book, who shared their stories with me, and Garen Bennett being two of them, but Abella and Michael. And Meg as well. So, and a couple of other people who were in it anonymously, who I won't mess up by naming. So, but thank you all. I mean, this is, it is structured around my story because I hope that would make it personal and compelling, but it is not just my story. That's the point. So a lot of people contributed.
and as I said to Christine before we came in here, I get piles of these books, and most of them stay in the pile, and I really did enjoy reading this one, so I can commend it to all of you. So please
Thank
join
you.
me in thanking Christine, Michael.